What happens when a journalist, known for his sharp commentary, takes aim at a household name, Big Shaq, one of the most beloved figures in entertainment today? What he didn't expect was a response that would leave everyone in that crowded space silent, unsure of how to process what had just happened. Stick around as we reveal the moments that led to an unexpected silence, one that spoke louder than words ever could. Today's story takes us to a seemingly ordinary moment, a public exchange between Big Shaq and a journalist. But what started as a playful interaction quickly turned into something no one could have predicted. The crowd stood still. It wasn't the laughter or the insults that held their attention, it was something else entirely. Before we get started, I want to thank you for stopping by. We've got plenty more stories just like this, so make sure to hit that like button, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. And hey, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from today, we'd love to hear from you. Let me introduce you to Alex Grant, a journalist whose reputation for strong opinions precedes him. Known for his quick wit and fearless approach to controversial topics, Alex didn't shy away from voicing his thoughts on anyone, no matter their status. On this particular day, however, his target was none other than Big Shaq, the viral comedian rapper who had captured the attention of millions with his unique humor and infectious personality. Big Shaq, known for his sharp comedic timing and easygoing nature, didn't expect that a typical day out would suddenly turn into a public confrontation. He had built a name for himself by making people laugh, not by engaging in debates. Yet, when he found himself face to face with Alex, it was clear that something was about to shift. You see, Alex was ready to stir the pot. In a crowded space, where people were gathered to enjoy the day, Alex saw an opportunity. Big Shaq, who had never been one to shy away from playful exchanges, was in for something far different this time. He made a quick, sarcastic remark, mocking Shaq's rise to fame. The crowd around them noticed the tension building, but most didn't realize the depth of what was about to unfold. Have you ever been in a situation where you were taken by surprise, where something you weren't expecting suddenly hits you? Imagine how Big Shaq might have felt when the mockery started. But what happens when someone responds in a way that no one anticipates? The room fell into a hush as Big Shaq, known for his humor and lightheartedness, paused for a moment. The crowd waited, unsure of what would come next. Would he brush it off, joke it away like he always did? Or would this be different? We've all been in a situation where we've been pushed a little too far. So, what would you do? How would you respond if someone took a shot at you publicly, even when you didn't expect it? Alex wasn't known for holding his tongue, and on this day, he made it clear that he wasn't about to back down. He walked up to Big Shaq, his eyes locked on the man who had turned viral hits into a massive career. Without hesitation, Alex threw out a biting remark that echoed through the space, aimed squarely at Shaq's rise to fame. "You're Big Shaq, right? So, what's next for you?" Alex asked, a smirk playing at the edges of his mouth. "Another meme song, or are you actually going to try to be a real artist?" The words hung in the air, as sharp as the tension that followed. The crowd could feel it. It wasn't just a comment, it was a challenge. The kind that could make anyone bristle. But Big Shaq, ever the comedian, responded in a way that only he could. With a nod and a smile that suggested he wasn't bothered, Shaq shot back, "I'll let you find out." The atmosphere shifted. There was no laughter, no playful banter. Instead, the crowd was left in a stunned silence. Some people glanced around, unsure whether they should even breathe. Others, more familiar with Shaq's way of handling these moments, waited for the punchline. But this time, it wasn't coming in the way they expected. What did Big Shaq mean by that? Was he brushing it off with his usual humor, or was there more to this exchange than anyone could see? And here's where the story gets interesting. Not everyone in the crowd was waiting for the classic Shaq comeback. Some people in the room started to sense that something different was happening. Shaq wasn't just letting it slide. He wasn't retreating into his humor like usual. Something about his calm, controlled response made everyone pause. Can you remember a time when you were confronted unexpectedly, maybe even mocked, and had to decide how to respond? Did you go for the easy laugh, or did you take a different route? What would you have done in Shaq's position? This moment, small as it may seem, was about to become something much bigger than just a celebrity encounter. It was about how a moment of tension could shift everything. Shaq wasn't just defending himself, he was letting his silence do the talking. And what was said next would leave even the most vocal observers speechless. Big Shaq didn't rush into his usual quick-witted comeback. Instead, he paused. For a moment, he was still, almost too still. His eyes locked with Alex's, his face unreadable. The playful spark that usually lit up his expression was absent. The crowd could feel it immediately. Something wasn't the same. This wasn't the Big Shaq they were used to. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick. No one knew what would happen next, but the feeling in the air was unmistakable. The tension wasn't coming from anger, but something deeper. As Shaq finally broke the silence, his words were not what anyone expected. "You know," he began, his voice steady, "sometimes people have a lot to say about what they don't understand. But that's okay. We're all figuring it out, right?" There was no sharp jab. No cutting remark. It was a quiet, almost philosophical response, but it landed like a heavy weight. The crowd, who had been waiting for a typical Shaq response, was now forced to reckon with something entirely different. Shaq wasn't backing down, but he wasn't escalating the situation either. He simply spoke from a place of quiet confidence, as though he wasn't going to engage in a battle of words that didn't matter. Alex, clearly caught off guard, took a step back. For a brief moment, he seemed to reconsider his approach. His usual quick retorts weren't coming as easily. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, the words clearly not forming as he had expected. The crowd, sensing the shift, grew even quieter. Everyone was waiting for what Alex would say next. But then, unexpectedly, the journalist stood there silent, unsure how to respond. What had just happened? Could Big Shaq's calmness have diffused the situation in a way no one saw coming? Isn't it strange how sometimes the most powerful response isn't the one that makes the most noise, but the one that demands nothing at all? At this point, the question lingered in the air: who was winning this exchange? Was it Alex, the journalist who had thrown the first verbal punch? Or was it Big Shaq, whose silence spoke volumes and left the crowd questioning everything? What would you have done in that moment? Would you have tried to keep pushing, or would you have respected the calm that Shaq displayed? The moment wasn't dramatic. No big speeches or grand gestures. It wasn't the kind of moment that makes headlines, yet somehow, it felt more powerful than anything else. The silence that followed was its own statement. It wasn't a gotcha moment, but it didn't need to be. Big Shaq's response was simple, and in that simplicity, the weight of it landed even harder. The crowd stood still, unsure of what to do next. Some exchanged glances, the unspoken question hanging in the air: was that it? Was there more coming, or had Big Shaq just delivered the final word, without raising his voice? But there was no follow-up from Shaq. He didn't give them another line to latch onto. He didn't rush in to win the interaction. Instead, he let the moment sit. He had said what he needed to say, and it was up to everyone else to process it. What did that mean for Alex? What did it mean for everyone else standing around, caught between expectations and reality? People had come into this moment thinking it would play out a certain way, loud, quick, full of back and forths. But instead, they were left in a silence that said everything without uttering another word. And sometimes, silence is more powerful than anything we say. How often do we feel the need to fill the silence with something more? Something bigger, louder, to show we're in control? But sometimes, it's the quiet moments that reveal the true strength. Now, think about Alex. What was running through his mind at that exact moment? He had set out to provoke, yet here he was, standing face to face with someone who didn't meet his challenge with more words, but with nothing at all. Did it make him reconsider his own approach? Was there a flicker of understanding, or was he simply caught off guard? And what about the crowd? Were they disappointed that they didn't get the drama they were expecting? Or were they starting to realize that sometimes, you don't need a confrontation to make a point? This moment leaves you wondering, when is silence more effective than speaking your mind? What do you think? Alex stood there, frozen for a brief moment. He had expected something else. He was ready to fire back, to continue the back-and-forth banter that everyone anticipated. But Big Shaq's response had thrown him off balance. His usual quick comebacks, those sharp words that always seemed to be at the tip of his tongue, were nowhere to be found. For once, Alex was quiet. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His shoulders tensed, and he looked down for a moment, as if searching for something to say, but there was nothing. For what felt like an eternity, the two of them stood there. The crowd, which had been waiting for the next exchange, fell into a heavy silence. The tension in the air was palpable, but it wasn't the kind of tension you could cut with a knife. It was a stillness that made the whole scene feel almost unreal. What was going through Alex's mind right then? He wasn't used to being caught off guard. He had always prided himself on having the perfect retort, the right thing to say in every situation. But this? This moment had taken him by surprise. And in that silence, it became clear to everyone watching, Big Shaq had already won. But not with more words. Not with a clever one-liner or a jab. It was his calmness, his ability to remain composed, that had turned the tables. Isn't it fascinating how sometimes the most powerful response isn't the loudest one? How often do we feel the need to rush to fill a silence, to speak just to keep things moving? But here, Big Shaq showed us that a well-timed pause can be more impactful than any words. And then, there's Alex. How often do we assume that having the last word means we've won? Did he realize, in that moment, that maybe the power was in his own inability to respond? Could the silence be the response he never expected? As the seconds passed, something started to shift in the crowd. It wasn't immediate, but slowly, people began to realize what had just taken place. Big Shaq hadn't responded in the way they'd expected. He didn't raise his voice or get defensive. There was no sharp remark to shoot back at Alex. Instead, he had simply stood his ground, silent, calm, and steady. And it was in that stillness that the real weight of the moment settled in. The reactions from the onlookers were subtle at first. Some began nodding, as if they had witnessed something important, something that wasn't immediately obvious, but profound. Others remained frozen in place, almost as if trying to process the simplicity of what had just occurred. A quiet murmur started to spread, but it wasn't a typical crowd buzz. It was more reflective, more thoughtful. One person, breaking the silence, leaned toward their friend and whispered, "Wow, I didn't think he would say that." Another, still in disbelief, muttered, "He really didn't bite back." That was a different kind of response. What had they seen? It wasn't just the words or the lack of words. It was the calm confidence that Shaq had exuded. He hadn't needed to prove anything. He hadn't needed to raise his voice to claim his place in the conversation. In a world where everyone seems to want to win every exchange, here was a moment where doing nothing spoke volumes. It raises a question, doesn't it? How often do we find ourselves caught in the need to argue back, to defend our position, to prove our worth? What if, sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is simply stand firm in our silence, in our own sense of who we are? Let me ask you, how do you react when someone tries to provoke you? Do you feel the pressure to defend yourself, or can you remain calm and composed like Shaq? Think about it, when was the last time you chose not to react? Think about how the crowd reacted, too. They didn't need to hear more words to understand the message. Sometimes, we overestimate the need for words when the real impact comes from how we carry ourselves, how we respond without saying anything at all. As the silence stretched on, Alex stood there, the words stuck in his throat. He took a step back, his expression betraying a rare moment of self-awareness. For the first time in what felt like forever, the confident journalist was uncertain. He didn't say it aloud, but it was clear, no matter how many jabs he had thrown at Big Shaq, it was Shaq's calmness that had stolen the moment. The power in his silence had dissolved every sharp remark Alex had been preparing. Alex had spent years building his reputation on his words, quick, clever, always ready with a comeback. But here, in this fleeting exchange, he'd been faced with something he didn't know how to respond to. Shaq's stillness had stripped his words of meaning, and in that, Alex felt an unfamiliar vulnerability. It wasn't about losing the argument, it was more than that. Shaq had proven, in that simple moment, that sometimes the best response is no response at all. Alex stood there for what felt like a lifetime, trying to reconcile the defeat he wasn't ready to admit. For him, a man so used to dominating conversations, the realization was quiet, but it was unmistakable. Words alone didn't have power, especially when they were met with someone who didn't need to prove anything. This raises an important question: when was the last time you let silence speak for you? Have you ever had a moment where you chose not to respond, not out of fear, but because you realized the situation didn't demand a reply? Think about that. Do we often talk too much just to be heard? Or is there strength in knowing when to stay silent? Could your silence sometimes say more than your words ever could? The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the moment lingered. Big Shaq, calm as ever, stood there with that quiet confidence. No need for grand gestures or a taunting remark. His simple smile seemed to say everything. For those who had been watching, this wasn't just about two public figures exchanging words. It was about something more. Big Shaq, the entertainer, had revealed a different side, a side that wasn't swayed by mockery or bravado. His presence, unshaken and steady, commanded more respect than any words could have conveyed. As for Alex, the journalist who had expected to outwit Shaq, the silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. His typical sharpness, his usual cutting remarks, all felt hollow now. He stood there, trying to regain composure, but it was clear, words weren't the answer anymore. In the end, what unfolded between Big Shaq and Alex Grant wasn't just a moment of confrontation. It was something far more significant, a demonstration of true strength. Not the kind of strength that demands attention or approval, but the kind that comes quietly, with confidence and self-assurance. Shaq's response wasn't a fiery retort. It wasn't a well-crafted defense. It was simplicity at its finest, calmness that spoke volumes. In that silence, he took away the power of mockery, without ever raising his voice. What can we take away from this? Sometimes the loudest voices in the room aren't the ones that make the biggest impact. It's the ones who stay grounded, who don't let provocations dictate their actions, who end up leaving a lasting impression. Big Shaq didn't need to fight fire with fire. Instead, he extinguished it with composure, a reminder that strength is as much about restraint as it is about action. So, what do you think? Was Big Shaq's quiet response the perfect counter to Alex's challenge? Or was the journalist justified in trying to provoke him? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you believe that sometimes silence can be the most powerful response, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more thought-provoking stories.